At exactly 2:17 a.m. on September 3rd, 2024, Earl McKinney's rusty tow truck pulled up to a pristine Rolls Royce abandoned outside a Dallas warehouse. The call seemed routine, another rich kid's car to impound. But when Earl finally cracked open that trunk 6 hours later, he discovered $17.8 million in cash that belonged to the most dangerous underground poker network in Texas. By dawn, Earl had vanished into the desert with America's biggest unsolved heist. But this wasn't the story of a greedy old man looking for easy money. This was the story of a forgotten veteran who decided he deserved one last ride after 35 years of cleaning up other people's messes. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. Earl McKinney sat in his rusted Ford F-350 tow truck, nursing his third cup of gas station coffee and watching the rain streak down his windshield. At 63, he'd been pulling cars out of ditches, impounding vehicles for unpaid tickets, and hauling wrecks to junkyards for longer than most cops had been alive. His back ached constantly from lifting chains and winching vehicles onto his flatbed. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, brake fluid, and transmission grease. His bank account held exactly $347.23. The eviction notice sat on his passenger seat, crumpled and coffee-stained. 3 months behind on lot rent at Sunset Mobile Home Park. His ex-wife Sandra had taken half his pension in the divorce settlement 2 years ago. His son Blake hadn't returned his calls since Christmas. The cancer diagnosis from last month sat in an envelope on his kitchen table. Unopened bills from the oncologist stacked beneath it. No insurance meant no treatment. Simple math. The dispatch radio crackled to life through the static. Unit 47, we got an abandoned vehicle blocking warehouse access on Industrial Boulevard. Probably another joyrider dump job. Easy pickup. Earl keyed the mic with a thumb that had been broken 3 times over the years. Copy that, dispatch. En route to location. He'd done this dance thousands of times in 35 years. Rich kid takes daddy's car for a spin, gets scared when the party gets too wild, abandons it somewhere convenient, and reports it stolen the next day. Insurance handles the paperwork. Parents handle the consequences. Earl handles the towing. Easy money. $150 for a basic pickup, plus daily storage fees if nobody claimed it within 72 hours. Earl pulled up to the address and immediately knew something was different. The warehouse district was dead at this hour, nothing but empty loading docks and broken streetlights. But this particular building had serious security cameras positioned at every corner, motion sensors along the roofline, and the kind of perimeter lighting that cost more than Earl made in a year. This wasn't some random storage facility. And there it sat, a pristine black Rolls Royce Phantom, not a scratch on it, parked perfectly between the yellow lines like someone had used a ruler. No license plates front or rear, but a laminated parking pass hung from the rearview mirror. Earl could make out a Crown logo and some fancy script writing that looked expensive. Too clean, Earl muttered to himself, walking around the vehicle with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every kind of automotive disaster. In 35 years, he'd never encountered an abandoned car this expensive without some kind of obvious damage. Usually they were crashed into trees, vandalized by angry ex-girlfriends, or stripped for parts by desperate addicts. He peered through the windows. Pristine black leather seats that probably cost more than his truck was worth. A dashboard that looked like something from a spaceship, all digital displays and chrome buttons. The interior was immaculate. No fast food wrappers, no cigarette burns, no coffee stains. Like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Earl hooked up the chains and winched the rolls onto his flatbed with a hydraulic system that wheezed and groaned, but still got the job done. As he drove back to his impound lot on the outskirts of Dallas, something rattled in the trunk every time he turned a corner or hit a pothole. Could be a loose spare tire, could be golf clubs, could be anything. Rich people were always leaving expensive stuff in their cars like money was no object. Back at McKinney Towing and Recovery, Earl parked the Rolls between a rusted Honda Civic with a busted windshield and a pickup truck with 3 blown tires and a bent frame. The contrast was almost comical, like parking a diamond between 2 lumps of coal. He filled out the standard paperwork on his clipboard: vehicle description, location found, condition assessment, estimated value. All routine stuff he could do in his sleep after 3.5 decades. But that rattling sound bothered him. It wasn't the random noise of loose objects rolling around. It was rhythmic, purposeful, like something heavy shifting in a container designed to hold it. Earl had learned locksmithing in the Army, back when he was young, and the world made sense, and America was fighting a war that nobody wanted to talk about. Vietnam had taught him to be curious about things that didn't add up, to notice details that might save his life. And nothing about this car added up. Too expensive, too clean, too convenient. He grabbed his lock picks from the toolbox mounted behind his truck's cab. The leather roll contained picks he'd acquired over 4 decades of legitimate and semi-legitimate work. Repo jobs sometimes required getting into vehicles without keys. Impound work meant accessing cars to inventory contents for legal purposes. The rolls had a fancy electronic lock system, but Earl had learned to defeat those years ago when luxury car repossessions required more sophisticated techniques. The trunk popped open with a soft, pneumatic hiss that sounded like money. Inside were 4 leather briefcases, each about the size of a laptop bag. They looked handcrafted. Real leather with brass fittings and combination locks that gleamed under the fluorescent lights of his garage. Earl lifted one. Heavy. Really heavy. Not laptop heavy. Not documents heavy. Gold bar heavy. His heart started beating faster, the way it used to in the jungle when something didn't smell right. Earl carried the first briefcase to his office trailer and set it on the desk under the buzzing fluorescent light that had been flickering for 2 years. The combination lock was a standard 3-digit model, the kind he'd cracked hundreds of times during repo work when people tried to hide valuables in locked cases. He started with 000 and worked his way up systematically, listening for the tiny clicks that indicated correct numbers. At 007, the lock clicked open with a sound like destiny. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills, rubber-banded in neat bundles with bank counting labels still attached. Earl's hands shook as he pulled out a bundle and counted with the careful precision of someone who'd never had enough money to be careless with it. 100 bills, $10,000 in his hands, more cash than he'd held in his entire life. He counted the bundles in the first briefcase with growing amazement. 45 bundles, $450,000. More money than his father had made in 20 years of factory work. More money than Earl had made in the last decade of towing cars. Earl walked back to the rolls on unsteady legs and retrieved the other 3 briefcases. Same weight, same dimensions, same expensive leather craftsmanship. If they held the same amount, 2 hours later, Earl had counted $1.8 million in cash. He recounted twice to make sure, laying the bundles out on his trailer floor in neat rows like a banker's wet dream. More money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of towing cars for $150 a pop. More money than existed in his entire world of trailer parks and truck stops and 24-hour diners. But tucked into the last briefcase beneath the final stack of hundreds was a business card that made his blood run cold. Royal Flush Enterprises, discreet financial services, with a phone number and nothing else. No address, no logo, no website. Just a number and the kind of discretion that came with serious consequences. Earl stared at the card for a long time, turning it over in his oil-stained fingers. Every instinct told him to pack the money back up, return it to the car, and forget this ever happened. But curiosity had always been his weakness, and curiosity killed more than cats. He dialed the number. A gravelly voice answered on the first ring, like someone had been waiting by the phone. "You have something that belongs to us. This is Earl McKinney with McKinney Towing and Recovery. I impounded a vehicle earlier tonight that had some items in the trunk. Just trying to do the right thing and notify the owner." "We know who you are, Earl McKinney. We know where you live. Sunset Mobile Home Park, Space 47. We know you owe 3 months back rent to Mrs. Patterson. We know your son Blake works for Henderson and Associates law firm in Austin. We know you have lung cancer and can't afford treatment." Earl's blood went cold. These people had done their homework fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that came with resources and connections and the ability to make problems disappear. "Return our property by sunrise, or you'll disappear like others who've interfered with our business. And Earl, don't think about involving law enforcement. We have friends everywhere." The line went dead with a click that sounded like a coffin closing. Earl sat in his trailer that night, surrounded by $1.8 million in cash, and the worst decision of his life. He could return the money and hope they let him live, though he'd seen enough movies to know that witnesses didn't usually get happy endings. Or he could run, though where could a 63-year-old tow truck driver hide from people with this kind of reach? But Earl McKinney had been running his whole life, running from Vietnam nightmares that woke him up screaming, running from his ex-wife's demands for alimony that left him eating ramen noodles 3 meals a day, running from his son Blake, who blamed him for choosing work over family, for missing school plays and baseball games and birthday parties because someone needed their car towed right now, running from the cancer diagnosis that he couldn't afford to treat, that would kill him slowly and painfully while he worked 16-hour days just to pay rent on a trailer that wasn't even his. For 35 years, he towed Bentleys and Ferraris and Lamborghinis, hooking million-dollar cars onto his beat-up truck and hauling them to body shops where they'd be repaired with parts that cost more than his annual income. He'd watch rich kids wreck cars worth more than his house and buy new ones the next day like it was nothing. He'd seen people throw away more money on a single night out than he made in a month. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to take something for himself for once. Earl fired up his nephew's old laptop and searched for Royal Flush Enterprises. What he found made his hands shake worse than the cancer tremors. News articles about missing persons across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, all connected to underground gambling operations that moved money through legitimate businesses. Police investigations that started with promising leads and ended with closed files and transferred detectives. Witnesses who gave statements and then disappeared without forwarding addresses. He'd stumbled into something big, something that got people killed in creative ways that looked like accidents. By 4 a.m., Earl had discovered that Royal Flush Enterprises operated 23 illegal poker clubs across the Southwest, and the deeper he dug, the more terrified he became. What started as simple curiosity had become a nightmare of connections that reached into every level of society. The first club he found online was called the Crown Room in Houston, supposedly a private gentlemen's club for oil executives and real estate developers. But the photos showed poker tables worth more than most people's houses, and the membership list read like a who's who of Texas corruption. Judges, police captains, city councilmen, even a few state legislators, all gambling with money that definitely didn't come from their government salaries. Earl cross-referenced the addresses and felt his stomach drop. He'd towed cars from that exact location 17 times in the past 3 years. Always late at night, always expensive vehicles, always with instructions to ask no questions and accept payment in cash. He thought he was just dealing with rich guys who didn't want their wives to know about their gambling habits. Now he understood he'd been an unwitting part of their operation. The money laundering scheme was sophisticated beyond anything Earl had imagined. Royal Flush owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Crown Automotive locations that sold Bentleys, Rolls Royces, and other ultra-expensive vehicles. On paper, these dealerships had incredible sales numbers. In reality, they were selling cars to shell companies that existed only on paper, using drug money and illegal gambling proceeds to purchase vehicles that were immediately stolen or totaled in convenient accidents. Earl recognized several of the dealership addresses. He'd towed stolen luxury cars from parking lots near these locations, vehicles that were reported stolen within hours of being purchased. The insurance payouts went to offshore accounts. The cars disappeared into chop shops, and everyone made money except the insurance companies and the taxpayers who ultimately paid the bills. As Earl scrolled through news articles and police reports, he began to see a pattern that made his hands shake. People who got too close to Royal Flush operations had a tendency to disappear or die in convenient accidents. Maria Gonzalez, a bookkeeper who'd noticed discrepancies in Crown Automotive's books, died in a single-car accident on a straight stretch of highway she'd driven safely for 15 years. The police report blamed driver fatigue. Thomas Chen, a federal auditor who'd started asking questions about Crown Automotive's impossible sales figures, committed suicide by jumping off a bridge, despite having no history of depression and 3 young children at home. The suicide note was typed, not handwritten, and mentioned financial pressures that none of his colleagues knew about. Detective Ray Fowler of the Dallas Police Department had been investigating connections between Crown Automotive and several unsolved crimes. He was shot during what appeared to be a routine traffic stop, killed by a suspect who was never found despite dozens of witnesses and security cameras. The case went cold within weeks, transferred to different detectives who somehow never made progress. Earl started recognizing names from his own work history. He towed Detective Fowler's unmarked police car after the shooting, taking it to a specific auto shop that was listed in police reports as the official evidence processing facility. Except Earl had looked up that shop after the job. It was owned by a subsidiary of Crown Automotive. He'd towed Maria Gonzalez's car after her accident, hauling the wreckage to a junkyard that, according to his invoices, paid him in cash and asked for no paperwork. That same junkyard appeared in several news articles as a location where evidence had mysteriously disappeared or been contaminated. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Royal Flush had people in police departments, district attorneys' offices, judges' chambers, and federal agencies. They moved money through a network of legitimate businesses that provided perfect cover for their operations. Car dealerships, auto repair shops, salvage yards, even towing companies. Earl felt sick as he realized how many times he'd unknowingly helped them. Every late-night tow job where he was paid in cash and told to forget the details. Every vehicle he'd hauled to specific locations without asking questions. Every time he'd been instructed to bypass normal paperwork procedures for insurance purposes. He pulled out his records from the past 5 years and started matching addresses and dates. The pattern was clear and damning. He'd been working for Royal Flush Enterprises for years without knowing it, helping them move evidence, transport vehicles, and maintain the illusion of legitimate business operations. The network extended beyond Texas. Earl found news articles about similar operations in Oklahoma City, New Orleans, Little Rock, and Phoenix. Always the same pattern. High-end gambling operations protected by corrupt officials, money laundered through luxury car sales, witnesses who disappeared or died in convenient accidents. The total scope was breathtaking. 23 known gambling locations across 5 states, generating an estimated $200 million annually in illegal revenue. The money flowed through dozens of legitimate businesses, employing hundreds of people who had no idea they were working for a criminal enterprise. Earl found financial records that had been leaked to a newspaper in Louisiana before the reporter died in a house fire that destroyed all his research. The records showed individual poker games where single hands involved more money than Earl made in a decade. Oil executives betting millions on cards, real estate developers using drug money to buy into games, politicians gambling with funds stolen from public works projects. But the most terrifying discovery came when Earl searched for information about the specific Rolls Royce he'd towed. The vehicle identification number led him to a purchase record from Crown Automotive Dallas, sold 3 days earlier to a company called Bayou Holdings, LLC, for $400,000 cash. Bayou Holdings, LLC was owned by another shell company, which was owned by another shell company, which ultimately traced back to a man named Vincent Carrera, a name Earl recognized from FBI wanted posters. Carrera was a high-level money launderer for Mexican drug cartels, suspected of moving billions of dollars across international borders. The $1.8 million in the rolls wasn't just gambling money. It was cartel money being moved from Houston to New Orleans for a transaction that Earl's theft had completely disrupted. He wasn't just dealing with corrupt businessmen and crooked cops. He was dealing with people who killed entire families for taking $20 from the wrong envelope. Earl sat back in his chair and stared at the screen, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. Royal Flush Enterprises wasn't just a gambling operation. It was a money laundering network that connected Texas oil money, Louisiana politics, Mexican cartels, and organized crime families across the Southwest. And he'd just stolen $1.8 million from people who'd killed federal agents for asking the wrong questions. The laptop screen blurred as Earl's eyes filled with tears of fear and rage. Fear for his life, for his son's life, for the innocent people who'd been murdered to protect this network of corruption. Rage at a system so broken that honest work had made him an unwitting accomplice to murder. He looked around his trailer, the eviction notice, the medical bills, the decades of barely scraping by while people like Vincent Carrera made millions from destroying lives. Earl had spent 35 years playing by the rules while criminals bought judges and politicians like used cars. Maybe it was time to change the rules. And now he had their money. A lot of their money. Earl called his son Blake for the first time in 2 years, knowing it might be the last time. "Dad, Jesus Christ, it's 4 in the morning. What's wrong?" Are you hurt? Blake's voice sounded older, more tired than Earl remembered. Like life was wearing him down the way it wore everyone down eventually. I need you to know I love you, even if I was a terrible father. Even if I missed your graduation and your wedding and all those years when you needed me. Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? Are you drinking again? Earl hadn't touched alcohol in 3 years, not since the divorce. But Blake wouldn't know that. They'd stopped talking about real things long ago. I can't explain everything. Just remember that whatever happens next, everything I did was because I didn't know how to do better. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. Earl hung up before Blake could respond, before his son could hear the fear in his voice. At 5:30 a.m., Earl's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, pounded on his door hard enough to rattle the aluminum frame. Earl, wake up! There's 2 black SUVs asking about you. Big men in suits. They don't look like cops, and they don't look friendly. Earl looked out his window through the blinds he'd installed for privacy. 2 black Escalades with tinted windows sat in the trailer park's main drive, like sharks in a goldfish bowl. Men in expensive suits stood beside them, checking phones and looking impatient. Professional muscle with the kind of patience that came from being paid well to wait. Time to go. Earl loaded the money into waterproof containers he used for storing tools during rainy season. He'd built hidden compartments in his tow truck years ago for spare parts and emergency supplies. Spaces that weren't obvious to casual inspection, but could hold what he needed. The briefcases were too recognizable, too fancy. But the money fit perfectly in tool storage areas that looked legitimate. He hooked the rolls back onto his flatbed and drove out the back exit of his lot, using service roads that only locals knew about. Farm roads and maintenance paths that didn't appear on GPS systems. The city boys in their fancy SUVs might have money and connections, but they didn't know the territory like someone who'd been hauling broken cars through rural Texas for 35 years. In his rearview mirror, he could see the black SUVs following, but they were falling behind on roads that required local knowledge and a willingness to scrape bottom on every pothole. Earl drove for 6 hours, staying on rural highways and farm roads, heading generally south toward the Mexican border. The Escalades fell behind somewhere around Waco, but Earl knew they'd have resources he couldn't imagine. Helicopters, surveillance networks, corrupt officials who could track his truck through official channels. Near Austin, his truck started overheating. The temperature gauge climbed into the red zone, and Earl could smell burning coolant mixed with the distinctive odor of a blown head gasket. 35 years of roadside repairs had taught him to always carry spare parts and emergency tools, but this was different. The radiator was shot, steam pouring from under the hood, and he was carrying $1.8 million in stolen money, with professional killers hunting him across 3 states. Earl pulled into a truck stop and parked next to a cattle hauler whose driver was checking tie-down straps. The woman looked to be in her 60s, weathered and competent in the way of people who'd spent their lives doing physical work in difficult conditions. "Ma'am, I need help. People are trying to kill me." Maria Santos looked into Earl's eyes and saw something she recognized. The desperation of someone fighting for their life against impossible odds. She'd seen that look in her husband's eyes before the factory accident that killed him. She'd seen it in her own mirror during the years when she'd struggled to support 3 children on a truck driver's salary. "What kind of help, old man?" Earl explained his situation without mentioning the money. Just that he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have, and dangerous people wanted him dead. That he was running for his life, and his truck was dying, and he didn't know who else to trust. Maria studied his face for a long moment, reading the lines of exhaustion and fear and desperate honesty. "My husband was like you. Worked hard, played by the rules, got stepped on by people with money and power. I'll help." While Earl made emergency repairs to his radiator with duct tape and stop-leak compound, Maria provided cover with her cattle truck. The dust and diesel smoke from her rig created a screen that hid Earl's activities from the surveillance drone he'd spotted, circling overhead like a mechanical vulture. Maria also introduced Earl to something he'd forgotten existed: the community of professional drivers who looked out for each other. Within an hour, Earl had coordinated with a dozen truckers over CB radio, creating an informal convoy that would escort him south toward the border. Men and women who understood that sometimes good people got in trouble through no fault of their own, and that the system didn't always protect those who needed protection most. But Royal Flush Enterprises wasn't giving up easily. Earl spotted the private military contractors at a way station near San Antonio. Ex-soldiers with tactical gear and serious weapons who looked like they'd stepped out of a war zone. They were checking every truck methodically, asking questions, showing photos. Looking for him. Maria saw them too. These aren't just criminals, Earl. These are professionals. Military contractors, maybe ex-special forces. Someone's paying serious money to find you. At the way station, Earl recognized one of the inspectors from his late-night research, a corrupt official named Rodriguez, who appeared in several news articles about investigations that had mysteriously stalled. The man was checking IDs and asking pointed questions about Earl's truck, getting closer to their position in the inspection line. Maria made a decision that saved Earl's life. As the contractors closed in on their position and Earl's truck came up for mandatory inspection, she deliberately jackknifed her cattle truck across the highway, creating a massive traffic jam, an emergency situation that gave Earl time to escape. Through a construction detour. "Go, old man," she shouted as her truck blocked the road and cattle scattered across the asphalt. "My grandchildren need to know there are still cowboys in this world." Earl reached the border at Laredo 12 hours later, but his problems weren't over. The official crossing was compromised. He could see Mexican border agents who'd obviously been paid to watch for his truck. They were stationed at the checkpoint with radios in hand, watching every vehicle that approached, coordinating with someone on the American side. But Earl wasn't the only veteran who'd been forgotten by his country. Through contacts he'd made in VA hospitals and unemployment lines over the years, Earl connected with a network of Vietnam veterans who'd been smuggling medical supplies to other vets who couldn't afford health care. Men who understood that sometimes the system failed the people who'd served it most faithfully. They guided Earl through an unofficial crossing route that had been used for humanitarian purposes for years, paths through the desert that didn't appear on any official maps. Guided by veterans who knew every rock and canyon from years of helping their brothers get the medical care their country had promised but never delivered. His military service finally paid dividends. These men recognized one of their own and were willing to risk everything to help. Earl crossed into Mexico as Edward McKenzie, automotive consultant, with documentation provided by men who understood that sometimes good people had to disappear to stay alive. The papers were professionally done, the kind of work that came from people who'd had to create new identities for reasons the government didn't want to acknowledge. In the Mexican state of Sonora, Earl used his mechanical skills to start a restoration business. He sold the rolls to a collector who didn't ask questions and paid in cash. No paperwork, no records. With that money and a careful portion of the Royal Flush funds, Earl established himself as a quiet American who paid his bills on time and helped when asked. For 6 months, Earl lived more peacefully than he had in decades. He restored classic American cars for Mexican collectors who appreciated craftsmanship over speed, employed local mechanics at wages triple the regional average, and never asked for payment from families who couldn't afford his services. His garage became known throughout the region for honest work and fair dealing. He video called his son Blake weekly, gradually rebuilding their relationship without revealing his location or circumstances. Blake had hired a private investigator to find his father after their last conversation, worried that Earl was in serious trouble. But Earl convinced him that he was safe, that he'd found work out of state, that they could talk regularly even if Earl couldn't come home yet. Blake began to understand that his father's choices had been about survival rather than indifference, about providing rather than abandoning. The conversations they'd never had began happening. Years of misunderstanding slowly dissolving into something like forgiveness. Earl also quietly helped his new community in ways that mattered. He sponsored the local baseball team, providing uniforms and equipment for kids whose parents worked in factories for subsistence wages. He paid for medical equipment at the clinic, ensuring that families didn't have to choose between healthcare and food. He provided scholarships for young people to learn automotive trades, creating opportunities that didn't exist before he arrived. But the past always catches up, no matter how far you run. One morning, a man walked into Earl's garage asking about restoring a 1967 Mustang. He seemed knowledgeable about cars, had cash for the work, and spoke perfect English with just a slight Texas accent that reminded Earl of home. The man introduced himself as Mike Torres, said he was a collector looking for someone who could do museum-quality restoration work. Earl recognized him immediately from his research 6 months earlier. Marcus Torres, a professional killer who'd worked for Royal Flush Enterprises and several other criminal organizations. The man didn't know that Earl had identified him, but Earl knew his peaceful life was about to end. "Nice place you got here, Mackenzie," Marcus said, examining the cars in Earl's shop with the practiced eye of someone who knew value when he saw it. "Heard you do good work. Real attention to detail." "I try to satisfy my customers," Earl replied, his hand moving closer to the heavy wrench on his workbench. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Funny thing about satisfaction," Marcus continued, running his finger along the pristine paint job of a restored Camaro. "Some people are never satisfied. They lose something valuable. They want it back, even if it takes months to find it, even if it costs more to recover than it was worth originally." Marcus turned to face Earl directly, and his jacket fell open just enough to reveal the pistol holstered underneath. "Hello, Earl McKinney. You cost us everything. Time to pay." Earl dove behind a workbench as Marcus pulled his weapon and fired. The bullet shattered the window behind Earl's head, and his employees scattered for cover, shouting in Spanish and English as they ran for the exits. But Earl had prepared for this moment. His garage had been set up with defensive positions that looked like normal work areas, escape routes that appeared to be simple storage spaces, and tools that could double as weapons if necessary. 35 years of dangerous work had taught him to always have an exit strategy. The fight was brief but violent, and for the first time in decades, Earl McKinney felt like a soldier again. Marcus fired twice more as Earl rolled behind the workbench, bullets sparking off metal tools and shattering glass. Earl's employees scrambled for the exits, shouting warnings in Spanish, but Earl's mind had already shifted into combat mode. 45 years melted away, and he was back in the jungle, outnumbered and outgunned, but not outthought. "You can't hide forever, old man," Marcus called out, moving methodically between the cars, using them for cover as he advanced. "This ends today." Earl stayed low and moved toward the hydraulic lift controls. Marcus was younger, stronger, better armed, but he was fighting on Earl's territory now. Every tool, every machine, every inch of this garage was a weapon in the right hands. Earl hit the hydraulic lift button, sending a 1970 Mustang Boss rising into the air with a mechanical whine that covered the sound of his movement. Marcus spun toward the noise, firing at shadows while Earl circled around behind him, using the engine block of a Camaro as cover. The killer was good, Earl had to admit. Military training, probably special forces. He moved with precision, checked his corners, kept his weapon ready. But he was thinking like a soldier in a battlefield, not like a mechanic in his own garage. Earl grabbed a bottle of brake fluid from his workbench and threw it hard at the fluorescent lights above Marcus. The bottle shattered, spraying corrosive fluid and broken glass, temporarily blinding the gunman as Earl dove for the air compressor controls. The pneumatic tools came alive with a sudden hiss of pressurized air. Earl grabbed the impact wrench, its steel socket spinning at 8,000 RPM, and swung it like a medieval mace as Marcus stumbled toward him, wiping brake fluid from his eyes and cursing. The impact wrench caught Marcus in the shoulder, the spinning socket tearing through his jacket and into flesh. He screamed and dropped his pistol, but recovered faster than Earl expected, grabbing a crowbar from the nearest workbench and swinging it in a vicious arc. Earl ducked, feeling the crowbar whistle past his ear, and kicked over a bucket of used motor oil. Marcus slipped on the slick concrete, giving Earl the opening he needed to grab the hydraulic floor jack. 60 pounds of steel and machinery that Earl had been lifting for 35 years. The two men circled each other now, Marcus with his crowbar, Earl with the floor jack. Marcus was bleeding from his shoulder, his expensive suit torn and stained, but his eyes still held the cold calculation of a professional killer. "You don't understand what you've done," Marcus panted, raising the crowbar. "That money belongs to people who don't forgive. They'll keep sending people until you're dead." "Then they better send someone tougher than you," Earl replied and rushed forward. The fight became a brutal dance of metal against metal. Marcus swung the crowbar with deadly precision, but Earl had spent decades wielding heavy tools in tight spaces. He blocked with the jack's handle, used its weight to power his attacks, and fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting everything he'd built. The turning point came when Marcus overextended on a swing, expecting Earl to retreat. Instead, Earl stepped inside the arc and drove the jack's lifting point into Marcus's ribcage. The killer doubled over, gasping, and Earl brought the jack down on his wrist, shattering bone and sending the crowbar clattering across the concrete. Marcus dropped to his knees, cradling his broken wrist, and Earl stood over him with the jack raised for a finishing blow. For a moment, the jungle came rushing back. The heat, the fear, the split-second decisions between life and death. But Earl McKinney wasn't 20 years old anymore, and this wasn't Vietnam. He lowered the jack and stepped back, breathing hard. "It's over." Marcus looked up at him with something like respect in his eyes. "You should have killed me." "I would have killed you." "That's the difference between us," Earl said, and walked away to call the police. The local community rallied around Earl as soon as they heard gunshots. Families he'd helped, workers he'd employed, neighbors who respected him for his kindness and generosity. They surrounded the garage with whatever weapons they could find. Machetes, rifles, even kitchen knives, protecting their benefactor from the outsider who tried to hurt him. As Mexican police secured the scene and paramedics treated Marcus Torres for injuries that would leave him permanently disabled, a woman in a business suit approached Earl. She looked out of place in the rural Mexican town, too clean and official for the dusty streets and humble buildings. "Earl McKinney, I'm FBI agent Sarah Chen. We've been looking for you for quite some time. Am I under arrest?" "That depends entirely on you. We want to talk about immunity in exchange for your testimony against Royal Flush Enterprises." Agent Chen explained that the FBI had been investigating the gambling network for years without success. Earl's theft had destabilized their operation, leading to internal conflicts that exposed their structure and methods. The Bureau wanted Earl's cooperation to bring down the entire organization, something they'd been unable to accomplish through traditional investigative methods. "You technically committed theft," Chen admitted, "but you also exposed crimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars and saved countless lives in the process. The Justice Department is prepared to offer full immunity in exchange for your complete cooperation." Earl looked around at the community he'd built, the life he'd created from nothing. "What about the money?" "Keep whatever you need for medical treatment and legal expenses. The rest goes to victim compensation and law enforcement operations. But Earl, you'll be recognized as a whistleblower, not a criminal. A hero, not a thief." The trials that followed made national news for months. Earl's testimony led to 89 convictions across multiple states, the seizure of $500 million in criminal assets, and the complete dismantling of Royal Flush Enterprises. His story captured the public imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. Tow Truck Driver vs. Criminal Empire became a best-selling book. The Last Honest Man in America became a documentary that won awards. Vietnam Vet Fights Crime with Tow Truck became a movie starring actors Earl had actually heard of. His son Blake moved to be closer to his father during the lengthy legal proceedings. Earl's cancer treatment was successful, funded by the Witness Protection Program and supplemented by his portion of the recovered assets. The experimental therapy that had seemed impossible became routine, and Earl's prognosis changed from terminal to manageable. Most importantly, Earl discovered that the missing money he'd hidden during his escape, $3.2 million he'd kept as insurance against future threats, was used to compensate families of people killed by Royal Flush Enterprises. Earl had kept detailed records during his investigation, ensuring that justice reached even the forgotten victims whose deaths had been written off as accidents or suicides. 2 years later, Earl McKinney worked as a consultant for the FBI's Organized Crime Unit. His methods became known as the McKinney Protocol, using working-class access and blue-collar invisibility to expose criminal networks that operated below the radar of traditional law enforcement. His truck became a mobile surveillance platform equipped with the latest technology. His garage in Mexico became a training facility where agents learned to blend into working-class communities. His story inspired 23 states to pass anti-corruption legislation that strengthened protections for whistleblowers and working-class heroes. Earl's transformation from forgotten veteran to federal consultant proved that sometimes the most ordinary people were capable of the most extraordinary things when they decided that enough was enough. The ripple effects continued for years. Veterans programs received increased funding after Earl's testimony highlighted how easily good soldiers could be forgotten. The trucking industry implemented anti-corruption measures that protected drivers from exploitation. Law enforcement agencies improved their relationships with working-class communities by recognizing that heroes came in all forms. Earl, now 68 and cancer-free, drove a new truck with FBI consultant plates and equipment that would have seemed like science fiction when he started towing cars. His son Blake rode shotgun as they headed to investigate reports of corruption in Arizona, their relationship stronger than it had ever been. The radio crackled with an incoming call. "This is Agent Chen. We have a situation in Phoenix that requires the McKinney protocol. Are you available?" Earl smiled and keyed the microphone. "This is Earl McKinney. We're on our way." In his rearview mirror, the open road and justice following behind. The man who towed the wrong car and took down an empire had become inspiration for working-class Americans everywhere. His story proved that sometimes the most ordinary people do the most extraordinary things when they decide enough is enough. Final statistics: 89 criminals convicted, $500 million in assets recovered, 23 victims' families compensated, 200-plus law enforcement officials trained in the McKinney method. Earl McKinney, from tow truck driver to federal hero, proving that justice doesn't always come from above. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.